Hello everybody, welcome to UK Gaming Network. I'm Zoidberg and welcome to the first video in the series of retro game Super Leagues. I've been producing these for a few weeks now in conjunction with the Amiga re-review, and I thought I would go a little bit more in depth into each Super League as they have appeared. You'll only get a few seconds to look at each one at the end of each episode, so I thought it would be nice to go through them and explain why and how I ranked the games the way that I did. In last week's video I covered Shadow Dancer, published by US Gold, so this is going to be the Super League for Sega games published on the Amiga. So without further ado, let's go. There are 36 games based on Sega properties released on the Amiga by various companies over the years, and we're going to go through all 36 of them now. So let's start with the first game on the list, which is Action Fighter. Now, Action Fighter was a Spy Hunter style shoot 'em up, published in 1986 by Sega. I think the Amiga version came out in 1988 and was published by Firebird and developed by Core Design. It was a fairly decent conversion. I'm going to start things off by sticking that in the OK category. I think that's the best place for it. So let's move on to the two versions of Afterburner that were released. The first one was published by Activision and developed by Argonaut Software, and that came out in 1988. Now, I don't think either of the versions of Afterburner are particularly great, but I think this is the better one of the two. Because it has mouse control option on it, I'm going to stick it in the OK category, but it's not as good as Action Fighter. Argonaut Software, in case you don't know the name, are the people who went on to make Star Fox for Nintendo. The other Afterburner was published by Sega themselves and from a developer called Weeby Games, who I hadn't really heard of before. It's not that great. It came out the following year. It's actually, according to Title Screen, Afterburner 2. So I'll stick that in the poor category. Next up is Alien Storm, which was published in 1991 by US Gold, and it was developed by Teartex, who were a fairly prolific developer of arcade games and movie tie-ins. Alien Storm is not that great. It's basically a beat 'em up, but instead of punching and kicking your way through the enemies, you just use the laser gun, I suppose you could call it, that you have. But it's rubbish, so I'm going to put it in the rubbish category right down at the bottom. Next up, we have Alien Syndrome, which was a top-down gauntlet-style shooter for 1 or 2 players. The Amiga version's not that bad, admittedly. Is it better than Afterburner? Yes, I'd say it's better than the Argonaut version of Afterburner. I'd probably put it above Action Fighter as well, to be honest. So yeah, I'm going to stick it there, but still in the OK category. Next is one of the more famous games published by Sega, Altered Beast. This one has appeared many times over the years on every console that you could think of. Usually it's a emulated version of the arcade original. Thankfully, it's not this utterly terrible Activision published Amiga version, which is marginally better than Alien Storm, but still rubbish. Next is Bonanza Brothers, which is a game that I first played on the Mega Drive. The Amiga version was released, I think, 1992, and developed by Twilight, who were the people who made Video Kid and WWF WrestleMania. I have talked about them on the re-review previously. The Amiga version of Bonanza Brothers is pretty decent. The only thing that stops it from being essential in my eyes is the fact that there aren't that many levels on it. I think there's only 5 or 6 levels. So I'm going to stick that in the good category. Next is a game called Crackdown. Now, this has nothing to do with the Xbox series. Instead, it's a split-screen 1 or 2 player maze-like shooter where you basically make your way through the levels and have to plant bombs and then get out. It's quite funky, especially if you can play it in 2-player mode. If you have a friend that you can join you, I wouldn't really put it above OK. It's better than Action Fighter, definitely. I'm going to stick it below Alien Syndrome and above Action Fighter. So next is another game that was where the Amiga version was developed by Core Design, and that's Dynamite Ducks, which is a cartoon beat 'em up. Basically, you control two massive cartoon ducks making their way through a Double Dragon style fighting game with cartoon graphics. It's completely inoffensive, enjoyable if you can get a second player to join you. I'm going to stick it below Action Fighter. Next is Cyber Police eSWAT, or eSWAT Cyber Police, whichever way around you want to put it. It's a Shinobi style action platformer. The Amiga version is not good in any stretch of the imagination. Comes from developer Creative Materials, who would go on to make the Final Fight conversion as well as The Godfather, but that's even worse than Alien Storm, so I'm putting it in the rubbish category right down there at the bottom. Next is one of the few impossible conversions that somebody attempted. This is G-Lock R360. The Amiga version was converted by Images Software, who were the same people that made Shadow Dancer. The game is fairly similar to Afterburner, really. You fly a series of missions, shoot down enemies, but you get different objectives per mission. I think it's better than the Amiga version of Afterburner. Got a lot of bad reviews back in the day, and I don't really know why. I mean, it's nowhere near as good as the arcade original. Let's get that straightened up. I'm going to put it between Dynamite Ducks and Action Fighter. Next up is another utterly terrible conversion. This is Galaxy Force 2, which was one of the many games developed by Software Studios for Activision. It's one of those games where the arcade version is massively technically superior to what the Amiga was capable of, but that didn't stop them from attempting to make it on the Amiga, so I suppose I should give it points for that. But it's terrible. I'm going to put it above Altered Beast, so right down there at the bottom. Next, it's the first time that you'll hear the name of Probe Software on this list. We have their conversion of Golden Axe. And surprisingly, this is going to go in the good category, and I think I'll put it above Bonanza Brothers. A lot of side-scrolling beat-em-ups on the Amiga were not that great, I must admit, like the versions of Double Dragon that came out. Renegade is utterly forgettable, and you should not be played by anyone. But Golden Axe is a surprisingly accurate conversion. It has everything that's in the arcade original, so I'm going to stick it in the good category. The graphics are good. It's got all the music. The only thing that keeps stopping it from being essential is the fact that they had to try and condense the game's controls onto a single button joystick. So a lot of the jump commands and things like that don't really work as well as they should. But it's still well worth playing, and it's going in the good. Next up is a game that I hadn't really heard of before attempting to do this list, called Hot Rod. This was published once again by Activision and developed by Software Studios. It's a perfectly inoffensive and playable racing game. The screen scrolls and punishes you if you don't keep up with the computer controlled cars. It's like Super Sprint, but nowhere near of that quality. I'm going to put it below Action Fighter in the OK category. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. Next is another game developed by Creative Materials, unfortunately. This is Last Battle, and it's better than eSWAT, definitely better than Alien Storm. I'm going to stick this in the poor category with the second version of Afterburner, because although it's not that good, the gameplay is fairly similar to Kung Fu Master, that kind of thing. There does seem to be a lot more to the game than just scrolling sideways and punching things. Like, there is a map screen for you to choose your way through the game, for instance. So it's got a little bit of replay value. although the Amiga version was nowhere near as good as the Commodore 64 version. So that's sticking right there in poor. Next is Line of Fire, which is once again another game developed by Creative Materials. It's essentially a light gun shooter where you go through the levels sat on the back of a jeep using your machine gun to shoot at various things. The arcade version is fairly entertaining, but like Galaxy Force and G-Lock, it's technically far more than the Amiga could handle, so I'm going to stick it above Galaxy Force 2, but still in the rubbish category. Definitely one that you should avoid playing. There are much better games of the same style on the Amiga. Next up is Outrun, which is just rubbish, so let's just put that there. Next up is Outrun Europa, which atoned for a lot of the errors that Probe Software made with Outrun. I'm going to stick that up in the good area. Outrun Europa is a game that I've covered on the re-review previously, and as I stated in the episode about it, the biggest problem that the game has is that it came out the same year as Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, which is technically far superior game. But this is but Outrun Europa is also by far the best game to carry the Outrun name on the Amiga, so sticking that in the good category. It's definitely well worth playing. Take out the two water-based levels, and you'd have yourself a really good Outrun game. So they drag it down a little. Next, we have Passing Shot, which is based on a Sega arcade tennis game. The main issue with this game, I mean, it does everything that you would expect. The main issue is that the way that the screen scrolls, you can't see the player that you're controlling, and needing to know where you're standing on the court when the computer opponent returns the ball to you is kind of an important part of playing any tennis game. Next up, we have Power Drift, which was like Line of Fire and Galaxy Force. There's simply no way that they could have converted the arcade game in a wholly satisfactory way, but this one is developed by the guy called ZZKJ, who also made a couple of games that are going to be coming up later. I'm going to stick this in the OK category because it's not terrible. The main issues that the game has are mainly that the Amiga isn't powerful enough to run a game like it. But it's probably as good a conversion of Power Drift as we ever could have got. Next, we have Scramble Spirits, which was developed by Tech Software, who went on to become Chrysalis. It's an upward scrolling shoot 'em up. Main problem there being there's far too many games like it on the Amiga already. It's not terrible. I'm going to stick it under poor, but it's right down at the bottom of the poor section. It's not just above being total rubbish. Next game we have is SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. This is one of the few games that on the Amiga that makes use of mouse and keyboard controls simultaneously. You move your satellite around with the keyboard controls and aim with the mouse. It works pretty well. It's not rubbish. I'm going to stick it in the OK category. So, is it better than the conversion of Afterburner? Yes, I think it is, and I think it's probably better than Dynamite Ducks as well. So I'm going to stick it just below G-Lock. Next up is the game that I talked about on the re-review last week. This is Shadow Dancer. It's as good a conversion as we could have got of the arcade original. It's not quite essential. I'm going to put it below Golden Axe, but above Bonanza Brothers. It's easily the best game of its kind on the Amiga. I think Images did a really good job of converting the graphics and sound and the gameplay. Like Golden Axe, it suffers from the fact that you have to play it with a single button joystick now, so some of the controls don't work quite as well as you would need them to. Which leads me on to Shinobi, which Shadow Dancer is the sequel to. The Amiga version of Shinobi has everything in it that the arcade original version does, but the graphics are pretty terrible and the scrolling isn't smooth at all. So I think that knocks a potentially great game down into the OK category. And I'm going to put it above G-Lock and above Hot Rod, just below Action Fighter. So next we have another upward scrolling shooter, this time called Sonic Boom. Nothing to do with the other Sega game that was released called Sonic Boom. This is certainly better than Scramble Spirits. The screens aren't as full of bullets, and you do actually feel like you've got a chance of surviving on this one. I'm still going to stick it in the poor category though, only for the simple fact that it's nowhere near as good as the likes of Xenon 2. Next we move on to 3 different Space Harrier games. I'm going to start with the first one, which is not first on the list here. This was published by Elite in 1988. It's a pretty decent conversion, I must admit. I'm going to stick this in the good category. I'm going to put it just below Outrun Europa. You can play it with mouse or joystick. The main thing holding it back is the loading times between levels. It's not really that much of a flow to the gameplay because of it, but it's still Space Harrier basically, so still fun. And right below that I'm going to put Space Harrier Return to the Fantasy Zone, which is essentially just it's essentially a data disc. It's more of the same, still just as good as the full conversion, but play the original first, because the difficulty level that this one starts at is the kind of difficulty level that you get to on later levels on the first game. So no point in starting with that one. Then we move on to Space Harrier 2, which is based on the Mega Drive sequel that came out. And to be quite frank, it's better on the Mega Drive. That's what you should be playing it on if you're going to play Space Harrier 2. The Amiga version isn't rubbish, but there are other games that I would say play before it. I'm going to stick it in the OK category, but I'm going to put it below SDI. Next we have Super Hang-On, which was one of the other games developed by ZZKJ, who also made the absolutely superb Spectrum version. Super Hang-On is, to be quite frank, superb. Goes straight into the essential category. It's easily the best motorbike racing game on the Amiga. It's a fantastic conversion of the arcade original. Whether you play it with mouse or joystick, you're going to have a good time. So if you haven't played it, then you absolutely should. Same applies to Super Monaco Grand Prix, which is the same developer once again. What stops it from being as good as Super Hang-On though is the gameplay is not as varied as you would like, and it also has some serious competition from F1 and Vroom in the racing game category. It's still an essential game though, and I would recommend you play it if you haven't. Next is Thunderblade, which is a game that I remember buying back in 1988 when I was only 14 years old. And it's one of those games that when you're that age and you buy a game, you try not to admit when you've made a mistake with your purchase. So I did actually play it a lot more than a lot of people would have done. So I'm going to put it towards the top of the poor category because it's not a great conversion, converted by TierTech software. But there's definitely something there that makes it worth playing and coming back to. But I'm going to stick it in the poor category. Next we have Time Scanner, which is based on a pinball style arcade game. And to be honest, just play pinball. Why would you bother playing this one? The physics isn't great. It's not terrible. It's a fairly accurate conversion of the arcade original, but it's not. I can't recommend that you play it, to be honest, when there's so many great pinball games on the Amiga already. So yeah, let's stick that in the poor category. There are plenty of golf games on the Amiga already, but Tournament Golf is a surprisingly decent one, and a surprisingly decent conversion of the arcade version. I'm going to stick that in the good category. The Amiga version was developed and published by Elite Software, same people that did Space Harrier. So I'm going to stick this in good up there with Space Harrier. Love it. Next we have Turbo Outrun, which is one of the few Amiga racing games that were developed by ICE Software, who also did Cisco Heat and Chase HQ2, two games that were also not really that great. The only thing that Turbo Outrun has going for it is that at least the car looks like a Ferrari and not a Ford Cortina, like the Probe Software version of Outrun. It's not good. Is it rubbish or is it poor? I'm going to stick it right at the bottom of the poor category, because it's definitely better than Outrun itself, but I still can't recommend that you play it. Next is Wonder Boy in Monsterland, based on an arcade game that also got converted to the Master System and Mega Drive. Never really been a fan of these type of Wonder Boy games. I love the arcade original, and I love Super Adventure Island, which is like the arcade original, but these Wonder Boy games where you have a little bit of an adventure and talk to people and that kind of thing, boring as far as I'm concerned. And the Amiga version was not a great conversion. Like, if you are going to play this game, play it on the Master System or play the arcade original. That's going to go in the poor category. But I'd still play it before I played Time Scanner. Is it better than Last Battle? Yes, I'm going to stick it above the Last Battle as well. So the last game on the list is World Championship Soccer, which is a fairly decent conversion of an arcade football game that Sega made in the mid 80s. Like a couple of other games that I've already mentioned on this list, though. Why would you play this when there are far better alternatives on the Amiga already? I'm going to stick it just above Thunderblade in the poor category. So there you have it. That's all 32 games that were based on Sega properties on the Amiga. As you can see, there's a lot of rubbish in there. Games that I wouldn't recommend that you play. But there's also some good stuff, surprisingly. If you agree with my listings that I've put here, then please feel free to tell me in the comments. If you disagree, please feel free to tell me in the comments. Hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look into why I've put the games the way that I did. And make sure you tune in to the next episode of the re-review, which is coming next Friday. So thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you all soon. Bye for now.